Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Did Shakespeare. I'm Casty Cash, that's Shakespeare Girl. This week we are diving back into the 16th century, having wrapped up our exploration into the great Shrewsbury clock that Falstaff mentions in Henry VI Part 1, or at least having narrowed it down to two options that we believe are most likely. Just to briefly catch you up on that story, you can go back to my Facebook page as well as earlier YouTube videos to see this entire story. But basically, we went looking for what clock Falstaff would have been talking about. And I came down to the conclusion that it was most likely Shrewsbury Abbey. But I have since joined a group, and I will share over to this and see if I can show you the group because you should go and check them out as well. It's called Memories of Shropshire, and this is a local group here that I went in and I posted my query to them because they live there. And they shared with me this really fantastic history of Shrewsbury and the idea that Shakespeare, his contemporaries, and they told me exactly who, Philip Sidney and Fulk Greville, were actually educated as what's called Shrewsbury School. And there is a library there now, and it had two sundials, and they think that he could have been referencing that came up as an option, which I thought was really interesting. To me, that doesn't seem like the right answer, but it could be. So that was really fun to learn about. The one that I didn't consider that they told me about was the old market clock. I told you guys that I knew the current old market hall clock there was new. It was 19th, 20th century installation, and I knew that, but there was an older one, and I could find pictures of it online, but I couldn't find anyone to tell me about it. And these people at Memories of Shropshire connected me with the history of that clock, and it does date to within medieval times, and it's still there. It's in the center of town, and sure enough, on the front of this giant building there is a clock. And because it is centrally located, it would have been a landmark for travelers and people visiting. It would have been this very ostentatious, notable landmark there. So if Falstaff had been passing through and wanted to reference something, it does actually make sense that he would have referenced this clock. So I'll place links to the earlier videos and this Facebook group down below so that if you're interested in exploring which clock would have been Shrewsbury clock for Falstaff, you can explore that at the links below this video. But for this week, we are taking a look at wristwatches. And the history of the most commonly used watch in the world, that of the wristwatch, is really a very interesting story. Today we have Apple watches and smartphone time-telling pieces, but were there portable watches in Shakespeare's lifetime? This week we're going to explore the evolution of small portable clocks by asking the question, did Shakespeare have a wristwatch? Wristwatches did not really become popular in England until after the invention of the waistcoat, and that was well after Shakespeare had died. But it was starting to get its legs during Shakespeare's lifetime. There was such a thing called an arm watch, and one of the most definitive ways that we know this is that we have a record of Robert Dudley giving an arm watch to Elizabeth I in 1571. I did not have time to go and find out if that specific watch still exists or what museum it might be housed in. So if you know, please include that information in the comments below. Glass first started being placed over the watch to protect it during the 16th century, but the more common portable watch, or the ancestor to what we have today as the wristwatch that was in existence during Shakespeare's lifetime, was known as a round pomander watch. There is one mention of the word pomander that I was able to find in Shakespeare's plays, and that comes from A Winter's Tale when Autoclytus says, "I have sold all my trumpery, not a counterfeit stone, not a ribbon, glass, pomander, brooch, table hook, ballad, knife, tape, glove," and he goes on to list a whole lot of things. And then he says, "By which means I saw whose purse was best in picture, and what I saw to my good use I remembered." Now, pomanders were incredibly popular, and they contained things like smelling salts or fragrances, and they were used both to keep the person wearing them smelling nice, or to be like a reviving, you smell the pomander when you feel sick or something like that, and you could carry it around. So the pomander was already portable and in use by people. There are several portraits of Queen Elizabeth wearing one and carrying it around. But the novelty or innovative design that got added to the pomander during Shakespeare's lifetime was for it to include a small watch mechanism. This happened around 1505 to 1510. Some historians that I found give, I believe his name is Peter Heinlein. Let me look, because I kept wanting to call him Paul, but it's not, it's Peter. Peter Heinlein developed this mechanism somewhere between 1505 and 1510. There is an example of a pomander watch credited to Peter Heinlein that has been dated by at least one museum to 1505. There are other historians that say Peter Heinlein didn't get this mechanism working and widely circulated until 1510. So I'm not sure precisely when those 5 years he figured that out and got it working, but sometime around the start of the 16th century is when this came into existence. Now, obviously, that is well before William Shakespeare was born, as William Shakespeare wasn't born until 1564. And so this is like 50 years before Shakespeare was born. But remember, this would have been an innovation that occurred in Shakespeare's parents' life and his grandparents' life. So it's something that would have impacted his life. 50 years is not a long stretch of time. So it is true that watches were in existence by the time Shakespeare was born. Another innovative design of a portable watch that dates to within this 16th century time period is called the spherical table watch. A man named Philip Melanchthon commissioned Peter Heinlein to design this. I don't know if he commissioned Peter Heinlein specifically. I know he commissioned this spherical table watch, and that the spherical table watch employed some of Peter Heinlein's designs. So let's be specific about that. But an example of Melanchthon's watch is housed at the Walters Art Gallery in Baltimore, Maryland, and it claims to be the earliest dated watch known. Now, this is interesting to me because there's a lot of qualifiers there, considering Heinlein's pomander clock is older than Melanchthon's watch. Melanchthon's watch dates to around 1550 or just before 1530, I think is the date they put on the actual sample they have there at Walters Art Gallery. And Heinlein's sample of a pomander clock dates to 1505 to 1510. So obviously the pomander watch is older. And I don't know if it's possible in horological circles that they are making a key distinction between watches and clocks that makes the Melanchthon's clock the oldest dated watch known, or whether or not like maybe the description was written before the pomander clock was discovered, and so that data that I found is outdated now. I don't know, but either way, the point for our study of William Shakespeare is that there are very few watches in existence today that predate 1550. And the ones that we do have, the round ones, were often called Nuremberg eggs. Nuremberg was the city where Heinlein was making these, and they were spherical watches, and so that's where it gets the egg name, is because it was shaped kind of like an egg, and a single winding, so you would wind it up and it would keep time for 12 to 16 hours, and it told time to within the half hour. Remember that minutes, or keeping track of individual minutes, did not come into being until after Shakespeare was living for William Shakespeare, and there are examples of this in his plays, specifically from A Midsummer Night's Dream, where minutes are considered a fairy language. To be able to track minutes or seconds is not something for the humans, in the consciousness of William Shakespeare and his contemporaries. But they were able to measure with Nuremberg eggs down to the half of an hour, which was a great step forward progressively in this technology. Interestingly, Melanchthon's clock, as opposed to the Nuremberg eggs, Melanchthon's clock, I did read one record that said his clock only measured hours. So it wouldn't have even measured half an hour. I'll have to look into that. That is a detail I'm unclear about, whether it measured the half hour or the hour. I know one of them measured half hours and one of them measured individual hours. What this does show us, though, having these pieces of evidence of clocks, is that small portable watches were in existence during Shakespeare's lifetime. Of course, I don't know whether William Shakespeare owned one personally or not, but I do know that they were around. His contemporaries were using them. People that he saw and interacted with were using them, so he knew what they were. And another kind of portable watch, which could have been in circulation and conceivably in the environment he was living in, is the oldest portable watch driven by a wound up clockwork instead of by like weights that fall down. It dates actually to 1430, and it's called the Watch of Philip the Good. Again, this predates Baltimore's sample, so I'm not sure about Baltimore's clock being the oldest known one, since we have Philip the Good's watch and it dates to a full century before that. So, little confusion on the dates exactly. But Heinlein's designs kicked off an entire Nuremberg neck watch industry. There is a record that shows Heinlein sold 15 of these gilded pomander for all purposes with a clock mechanism on the 11th of January in 1524. And they were called the pomander watch type. There are only two of that specific kind of watch known to survive. One is dated to 1505 and is the picture I showed you earlier. The other one is the one from 1530 that is the one at Baltimore. These clock watches were fastened to clothing or a chain around the neck. So you would wear them kind of like a necklace. If you listen to our latest episode on That Shakespeare Life, episode 69 with William Massena, he talks about how William Shakespeare would probably not have worn one of these neck watches because they were a type of jewelry. They were mostly for women. And this is an example. They wore it on a chain around the neck, and it had this heavy drum-shaped box, because that's one way that you could wear a pomander. And so it was a fashion statement. And what's really interesting about it was so much a fashion statement that it didn't actually tell good time, and people didn't seem to care. The actual functioning telling of time was something that would come later. And for people in William Shakespeare's lifetime, they would wear these clocks, and it did actually have a striking mechanism, so it could alarm or have a chime associated with the striking of the hour on the ones that you were wearing. The history that I looked up says that it would only ping twice a day, but the people who wore them, they didn't care so much about whether it told the time. That was this fashion statement. You were very in and very hip and very affluent and like, oh, this was a status quo thing for you to wear. And so people didn't care so much about whether or not it actually kept time. There is a reference to a clock watch in Shakespeare's plays. He uses the word clocks and watches a lot more than this example I'm going to show you. But in Richard II, 5-5, so Act 5, Scene 5, he says, I wasted time, and now doth time waste me. For now hath time made me this numbering clock. My thoughts are minutes, and with sighs they jar their watches on unto mine eyes, the outward watch, whereto my finger like a dial's point is pointing still, in cleansing them from tears. And then he goes on to wax poetic about the passage of time and show minutes, times, and hours, but my time runs posting on in Bolingbroke's proud joy, while I stand fooling here his jack of the clock. And I thought that was a really interesting phrase, jack of the clock. Why was he saying that, and what did it mean for William Shakespeare? Apparently, when Shakespeare uses this, he's punning on the word jack because it means a fool, but he's also referring to the colloquial language that was developing around the idea of clocks and watches and the measuring of time. There was a little hammer that would bang into a bell, so bell, bang, 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 to tell the time. And it was called the jack of the clock. It had the word jackmart assigned to it in an official professional sense. But as Wendy Beth Hyman describes for her paper called For Now Hath Time Made Me His Numbering Clock, Shakespeare's Jackmarts, the abstract for that paper reads like this. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, the word jackmart appears first in the early 16th century, a curious amalgam of the working class moniker jack with the French word for hammer, marteau. An articulated automation that struck a clock bell, a jackmart is a metallic embodiment of an ideology that conflates physical labor with dehumanization. Obviously, these are also themes that you see show up in Shakespeare's Richard II. Wendy Beth Hyman specifically cites Richard II and the representation of rude mechanicals. as all being tied into the automation jack being a pawn of history, and all these different ways that Shakespeare was meaning to talk about Richard II and playing into the story of his character and the history of England, while also employing some of the new innovative technology language that was going on around the clock. Additionally, to my ears personally, the word numbering sounds a great deal like Nuremberg and suggests that it's possible Shakespeare is actually referencing the Nuremberg eggs, which were possible when he was writing these, which were popular when he was writing these plays. Um, Especially considering it's Richard II that's speaking these lines, and it would have been the high nobility that had Nuremberg eggs in the first place. That's it for this week here at Did Shakespeare. I'm Cassie Cash, that's Shakespeare Girl. I hope you enjoyed learning along with me about the wristwatch. If you want to explore this further or see notes about the Shrewsbury clock we mentioned at the start of the episode, make sure you check out today's show notes. You can go to cassiecash.com/wristwatch. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.